The temperature in the driver's compartment, 48 degrees Celsius. The transmission fluid leaking. The final drive, already showing stress fractures after just 150 kilometers. Oberleutnant Ernst Bachmann sat in the commander's cupola of his Panther OS D and felt something he had been trained never to feel. Doubt, not about his crew, not about his orders, but about the machine itself. The propaganda ministry called it the finest tank in the world. The engineers who designed it called it a masterpiece of German technical superiority. But here, in the mud and blood of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1943, the Panther was revealing itself to be something else entirely, a magnificent contradiction, a technological marvel that couldn't survive its own excellence. In the next 40 minutes, he would discover that his tank, this supposed weapon of German invincibility, was more dangerous to its crew than to the enemy. This is the story of the Panther tank, the most feared and most overhyped weapon of World War II. But it's really about what happens when perfectionism becomes the enemy of practicality, when ideology overrules engineering reality, and when the pursuit of supremacy creates something too complex to actually work, and what it reveals about the fatal gap between what weapons look like on paper and what they become in the hands of terrified teenagers trying not to die. To understand what went wrong with the Panther, you first need to understand what the Germans believed they were creating. This wasn't just another tank. This was supposed to be the answer, the vindication, the proof that German engineering genius could overcome any material disadvantage. In the winter of 1942, German tank crews on the Eastern Front had encountered something that shattered their carefully constructed worldview. The Soviet T-34. It wasn't supposed to exist. Soviet industry was supposed to be primitive. Soviet design was supposed to be crude. Soviet technology was supposed to be a generation behind the Reich. But the T-34 possessed sloped armor that could deflect German shells, a wide-track design that handled mud and snow better than anything Germany fielded, and most humiliating of all, it was simple enough that Soviet factories could produce them by the thousands, while German precision manufacturing struggled to build hundreds. The German response was characteristically German. They didn't just want to match the T-34. They wanted to surpass it so completely that Soviet tank designers would look at the Panther and despair. They wanted a tank with better armor, better mobility, better firepower, better everything. They wanted perfection, and that desire for perfection would become the Panther's original sin. The Panther that emerged from the design bureaus in late 1942 was, on paper, exactly what they had dreamed of. Sloped frontal armor at 80 millimeters thick, effectively 140 millimeters when you calculated for the angle. A 75 millimeter KWK-42 L-70 gun that could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. A top speed of 46 kilometers per hour, a weight of 45 tons, somehow managing to be both heavier and faster than the T-34. The specifications read like a wish list from a tank commander who had been given unlimited funding and told to ignore reality. And that was precisely the problem. The Panther wasn't designed for the war Germany was actually fighting. It was designed for the war Germany wished it was fighting. The war where German industry had unlimited resources. The war where German factories had experienced workers instead of forced laborers and prisoners. The war where mechanical reliability was more important than production numbers. The war where tanks would be maintained by expert mechanics with unlimited spare parts and time. That war didn't exist. The war that did exist would chew up the Panther and spit it out in ways its designers never anticipated. Ernst Bachmann's first experience with his Panther should have been glorious. July 1943. His unit, the SS Panzer Regiment II, was being equipped with the new tanks for the upcoming offensive at Kursk. The largest tank battle in history. The moment when German armor would smash through Soviet lines and prove that technical superiority could still win wars. He climbed into the commander's position and immediately noticed something wrong. The ergonomics were terrible. The commander's cupola had 7 periscopes, which should have given excellent visibility, but they were positioned in a way that created blind spots. The internal layout was cramped, despite the tank's size, because so much space was devoted to ammunition storage and the massive engine. But those were minor concerns, operational annoyances. What happened during the first test drive was something else entirely. The driver, a veteran Panzer crewman named Wilhelm Schmidt, engaged the transmission. The Panther lurched forward with impressive acceleration. Then, after less than 3 kilometers, a grinding noise emerged from the final drive, then smoke. The unit's technical officer, Hauptmann Dieter Klein, ordered an immediate halt. When they inspected the final drive, they found metal shavings in the gear oil. The final drive, the critical component that transferred engine power to the tracks, was already failing. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Across the entire unit, Panthers were breaking down before they even reached the front line. Transmissions were failing, final drives were shattering, engines were overheating. Out of the 200 Panthers committed to Kursk, only 43 were operational by the end of the first day of combat. Not because of enemy action, because the tanks were destroying themselves. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about engineering philosophy, about the fundamental difference between German and Allied approaches to weapons design. The Germans had been taught, had built their entire industrial identity around the concept of qualitative superiority. One German tank should be worth 5 enemy tanks. One German soldier should be worth 10 enemy soldiers. This wasn't just propaganda. This was doctrine, and it had worked. Early in the war, it had worked brilliantly. German tanks, though fewer in number, had crushed French and British forces through superior tactics and adequate technical performance. But by 1943, the equation had changed. Germany was now fighting 3 major industrial powers simultaneously: the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain. And those powers had embraced a different philosophy: good enough, fast enough, and produced in overwhelming numbers. The Sherman tank wasn't as good as the Panther on a technical level, but America could build 5 Shermans in the time it took Germany to build 1 Panther. The T-34 wasn't as sophisticated as the Panther, but Soviet factories could produce them continuously, while German factories struggled with constant interruptions from strategic bombing. The Panther represented the peak of German technical ambition, and that's precisely why it failed. Because wars aren't won by the best weapon. They're won by the weapon that works when you need it, that can be produced in sufficient numbers, and that can be maintained by exhausted crews with limited resources. The Panther was none of those things. Let's talk about what made the Panther simultaneously brilliant and catastrophically flawed. The engineering challenges. The sloped armor was a masterstroke of design. By angling the frontal plate at 55 degrees from vertical, the effective thickness became far greater than the actual thickness. A Sherman's 75mm gun, the standard Allied tank weapon for most of the war, couldn't penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. This made the Panther nearly invulnerable from the front, but that armor came with consequences: weight, complexity, production difficulty. The Panther's armor plates were so thick and so angled that they required specialized equipment to manufacture. The welding had to be perfect because any weakness would create a point of failure, and perfect welding required skilled workers. By 1943, Germany's skilled workers were either dead on the Eastern Front or drafted into increasingly desperate combat units. The factories were staffed by forced laborers, prisoners of war, and women with minimal training. Quality control became a dark joke. Some Panthers left the factory with armor plates that were improperly heat-treated. They looked fine. They passed visual inspection, but under combat stress, they would crack. Not from enemy shells, but from their own structural deficiencies. The gun. The 75mm KWK-42 L-70 was a monster. At 2,000 meters, it could penetrate 124mm of armor. For context, the Sherman's frontal armor was 76mm. The T-34's was 45mm. The Panther could kill any Allied tank before they could effectively return fire. But again, brilliance created problems. The gun was so powerful that it required a complex recoil mechanism. That mechanism required maintenance, constant maintenance, and it required a trained crew to load the 2-piece ammunition correctly under stress. In combat, with shells exploding around them, with the interior temperature approaching 50 degrees, with visibility reduced to a few narrow periscopes, Panther crews were expected to maintain a rate of fire competitive with simpler Allied tanks. They couldn't. Soviet and American tank crews, operating simpler weapons, could fire faster and more reliably. Yes, they needed to get closer, but in the chaos of actual combat, getting closer wasn't as difficult as German planners assumed. The engine. This is where ideology met physics, and physics won. The Panther used a Maybach HL230 P30 V12 engine, producing 700 horsepower. Impressive, powerful, temperamental. The engine was designed to give the 45-ton Panther excellent mobility, and it did, when it worked. But it was temperamental in ways that would be comical if they hadn't gotten young men killed. The engine ran hot, not warm. Hot. The cooling system was adequate in theory, but inadequate in practice. In the summer heat of the Eastern Front, Panthers would overheat after sustained operation. The solution, according to the technical manual, was to stop and let the engine cool. But stopping in combat wasn't really an option, so crews pushed the engines beyond their design limits and watched them fail. In the winter, the opposite problem emerged. The engine was difficult to start in extreme cold. Soviet tanks, cruder in design, used simpler engines that could be started with blowtorches if necessary. The Panther required a careful warm-up procedure, time Germany's desperate situation increasingly didn't allow. But the transmission. This is where the Panther's engineering ambition became a death sentence. The Maybach transmission was a complex piece of machinery designed to handle the engine's power and transfer it to the tracks through the final drive. It was sophisticated. It was precise. It was garbage. The transmission had a fundamental design flaw. It couldn't handle the torque the engine produced, especially when combined with the tank's weight. Gears would strip, bearings would fail, the clutch would burn out, and the final drive, the component that connected the transmission to the tracks, was even worse. It was under-designed for the loads it experienced. German engineers had calculated the stress loads in ideal conditions. But combat isn't ideal conditions. Combat is mud, debris, sudden direction changes, panic maneuvers. The final drive on early Panthers had a service life measured in hundreds of kilometers. Not thousands, hundreds. Some Panthers broke down before they ever saw combat. Others made it to the battlefield and died there, not from enemy action, but from mechanical failure that left them as stationary targets. Ernst Bachmann experienced this firsthand at Kursk. His Panther had been repaired after the initial final drive failure. It had performed adequately during the approach to the battle, but on the third day of the offensive, during a flanking maneuver against Soviet positions, he heard the sound every Panther commander learned to dread. A metallic shriek from the final drive, then a shudder, then nothing. The tracks stopped moving. The engine was still running. The gun still worked. But the Panther was immobilized, in combat, under direct fire. His driver, Schmidt, tried to restart the drivetrain. Nothing. They were dead in the water, and dead was the operative word. Soviet tanks, inferior Panthers by every technical metric, were maneuvering to hit them from the sides, where the armor was weaker. Bachmann had two choices: stay and fight from a stationary position until they were inevitably flanked and killed, or abandon the tank. He chose survival. His crew bailed out under fire, leaving behind a Panther that had cost Germany enormous resources, that had been built by workers who should have been producing 3 simpler tanks instead, that represented the peak of German engineering ambition. And it died not in glorious combat, but from a failed gear assembly that had been improperly manufactured by exhausted laborers in a bombed-out factory. This was the Panther's war. This is the part of the story where we need to understand the psychological weight of what was happening to German tank crews. They had been promised the best equipment in the world. They had been told that German engineering was supreme, that technical excellence would compensate for numerical disadvantage. And here they were, climbing into tanks that were more likely to break down than complete a mission. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. You're 19 years old. You've been trained on the Panther. You know its capabilities on paper. You know it can kill enemy tanks before they can see you. You know the armor makes you nearly invincible from the front. And you also know that there's a 30% chance the transmission will fail before you reach the battlefield. You know the final drive might shatter during the first evasive maneuver. You know that if you break down, recovery vehicles are scarce and the enemy will find you before help arrives. How do you maintain faith in a weapon that betrays you as often as it protects you? This wasn't just mechanical failure. This was psychological warfare against Germany's own soldiers. The reports coming back from the front were devastating for anyone willing to listen. Field commanders who actually had to use Panthers in combat were sending increasingly desperate messages to high command. Not enough spare parts. Too complex to repair in field conditions. Reliability catastrophically low. Production numbers inadequate. And the response from Berlin? More Panthers. Better Panthers. The AOSF. A model addressed some transmission issues. The AOSF. Simplified production. But these were iterative improvements on a fundamentally flawed concept. Because the real problem wasn't engineering details. The real problem was that Germany was trying to win an industrial war with artisanal methods. Every Panther required 55,000 man-hours to construct. A Sherman required 10,000. A T-34 required even less. Germany was spending 5 times the labor to produce a tank that was marginally more effective in combat and significantly less reliable. The math didn't work, the economics didn't work, but the ideology demanded it. German supremacy wasn't just a propaganda claim, it was a psychological necessity for a regime built entirely on assertions of racial and technical superiority. Let me tell you about Hauptmann Richard von Rosen, a Panther Company commander who wrote extensively in his personal diary about the growing gap between doctrine and reality. In October 1944, his unit was defending against a Soviet offensive in Poland. His company had started the battle with 14 Panthers. Within 3 days, only 4 were operational. 3 had been destroyed by enemy action. 7 had broken down, not damaged, not repairable, just broken from the stress of combat operations. Von Rosen wrote, and I'm paraphrasing because his diary was never officially published, that he felt like he was commanding museum pieces instead of weapons. Beautiful, impressive, fragile. He described watching his crews perform heroically, not against the enemy but against their own equipment, changing final drives under fire because the original had failed after 200 kilometers, nursing overheating engines by limiting speed, which made them vulnerable to Soviet tank hunters, rationing ammunition because resupply was uncertain and each shell was precious. This wasn't the war they had trained for. This was maintenance under fire, logistics as combat. And slowly, day by day, the psychological foundation of German technical superiority was crumbling, not because of enemy propaganda, because of measurable, undeniable mechanical failure. The Panther's reputation among Allied forces is worth examining because it reveals something interesting about the gap between fear and reality. Allied intelligence reports from 1943 and 1944 are filled with warnings about the Panther. Thick armor, powerful gun, high speed. Allied tank crews were terrified of encountering them, and that fear was justified when the Panther worked. A well-positioned Panther with a competent crew was nearly unstoppable from the front. Allied doctrine emphasized avoiding frontal engagements, flanking maneuvers, numerical superiority. They treated the Panther like a tiger, to be hunted carefully and respectfully. But Allied maintenance crews and intelligence officers noticed something else. Panthers were frequently found abandoned with minimal damage, broken down on roads, destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The fearsome reputation was real. The operational reliability was fiction. By late 1944, Allied forces had learned that you didn't necessarily need to destroy a Panther in combat. You just needed to force it to maneuver aggressively, to stress the final drive, to push the engine beyond its thermal limits. The Panther would often destroy itself. Soviet tactics evolved even faster. Soviet tank commanders learned that Panthers were most dangerous at long range, where their guns' superiority mattered. So Soviet doctrine emphasized aggressive close-range assaults, often at night, often through terrain that limited long-range engagement. Force the Panther to move, force it to maneuver, force it to stress its own mechanical systems. And if you encountered a Panther and couldn't kill it immediately, just withdraw and wait. There was a reasonable chance it would break down if you made it chase you. This is how weapons mythology dies. Not in dramatic combat, but in the accumulation of small humiliations. The Panther was feared, and that fear was based on its genuine combat capabilities. But fear doesn't win wars. Reliability wins wars. Numbers win wars. The ability to field a weapon that works more often than it fails, That's what wins wars. Let's talk about the economic insanity of the Panther from a systemic perspective. In 1944, Germany produced approximately 3,800 Panthers. The United States produced over 17,000 Shermans. The Soviet Union produced over 11,000 T-34s. But the numerical disadvantage was actually worse than it appeared because of operational readiness rates. At any given time, only about 35 to 40% of Germany's Panther force was operational. Mechanical failures, awaiting parts, undergoing repairs. So those 3,800 Panthers translated to maybe 400 combat-ready tanks at any given moment. Meanwhile, Allied operational readiness rates were 70 to 80%. Simpler designs, better logistics, more spare parts. The Sherman you disabled today would likely be back in action tomorrow. The Panther you disabled today might be out of action for weeks. Now add in the resource cost. Each Panther required strategic materials that Germany was desperately short of. Molybdenum for armor, tungsten for shells, precision bearings, high-quality steel. These resources could have been used to produce 3 or 4 simpler, more reliable tanks, or thousands of anti-tank weapons, or aircraft, or anything else that might have actually improved Germany's strategic position. Instead, they were poured into a weapons system that looked magnificent and performed marginally. The human cost of the Panther's unreliability is impossible to calculate precisely, but we can make informed estimates. How many crews were killed or captured because their Panther broke down in combat? How many promising offensives stalled because half the Panther force couldn't reach the battlefield? How many defensive positions were lost because the tanks that were supposed to save them were sitting disabled 50 kilometers behind the lines? Ernst Bachmann survived the war, one of Germany's most decorated tank commanders, but he lost 3 Panthers to mechanical failure before he ever lost one to enemy action. 3. He wrote after the war, with the bitterness of a man who had believed and been betrayed, that the Panther was proof that Germany had lost touch with reality, that the regime's obsession with supremacy, with perfection, with proving German technical superiority, had created weapons too good to work, too complex to maintain, too expensive to produce in meaningful numbers. He had started the war believing that quality would triumph over quantity. He ended it understanding that quality without reliability is just expensive failure. Now we need to address the uncomfortable question at the heart of this story. Why didn't Germany fix it? They knew the problems. Field reports made it clear. So why continue producing a flawed design? The answer reveals something about how organizations, especially authoritarian ones, handle uncomfortable truth. First, there was the sunk cost fallacy. Germany had invested enormous resources in the Panther program. Admitting it was fundamentally flawed would mean admitting that those resources had been wasted. In a regime where failure could be fatal, no one wanted to be the person who delivered that message. Second, there was genuine disagreement about whether the problems were solvable. Some engineers insisted the transmission could be fixed, the final drive redesigned, the production quality improved. They weren't entirely wrong. Later, Panther models were more reliable, but more reliable still meant inadequate compared to Allied standards. Third, and most damningly, there was ideological blindness. The Nazi regime had built its entire identity on German supremacy. The Panther was supposed to prove that supremacy. Admitting it had failed wasn't just a technical acknowledgement. It was an ideological crisis. So the problems were minimized, blamed on crews, blamed on saboteurs, blamed on anyone except the system that had demanded perfection and gotten expensive fragility. In the final year of the war, Panthers were being fielded by crews with minimal training, supported by a logistics system that was collapsing, maintained by mechanics who were learning on the job because the experienced ones were dead. And the machines, these supposed masterpieces of German engineering, were failing at rates that would have been comical if the consequences weren't measured in lives. There are reports of Panthers being abandoned after moving less than 50 kilometers because the final drive failed and there were no spare parts. Of crews setting their own tanks on fire to prevent capture because towing a broken Panther was impossible without specialized recovery vehicles that no longer existed. Of units receiving new Panthers that broke down during the delivery drive from the factory to the front. This was what German technical superiority had become, a myth maintained by men who couldn't afford to admit the truth. The Panther's legacy is complicated. After the war, military analysts studied it extensively. The gun design influenced post-war tank development. The armor scheme became standard. In many ways, the Panther was ahead of its time. But being ahead of your time isn't useful if you can't build enough of them, can't keep them running, and can't support them logistically. The British built the Centurion tank after the war, incorporating lessons from the Panther. But they also incorporated the lesson of reliability. The Americans continued with the Sherman philosophy, eventually producing the M26 Pershing, which balanced firepower with mechanical dependability. The Soviets kept the T-34's basic concept and just made it bigger and better with the T-44 and T-54. Everyone learned from the Panther, but what they learned wasn't always what Germany intended to teach. They learned that technical excellence without practical reliability is worthless. That complexity is a vulnerability. That the best tank isn't the one with the most impressive specifications, it's the one that shows up to the battle and still works when the shooting starts. Let me tell you about one final Panther. In April 1945, in the ruins of Berlin, a Panther commanded by a teenager, we don't know his name, was positioned to defend a bridge. This was the end. Everyone knew it. The Red Army was blocks away. The war was lost. And this Panther, which should have been the weapon that won the war, that proved German supremacy, that justified 4 years of suffering, sat there with a broken transmission. The gun worked. The armor was intact. But the transmission was jammed in second gear. The crew could move forward or backward at walking speed. That was it. When Soviet tanks appeared, the Panther managed to fire 3 shots, hit 2 T-34s, killed 1. Then the engine overheated from the limited gear operation. The crew bailed out, and the Panther sat there, a monument to wasted potential, until Soviet engineers towed it away to be studied and scrapped. That's the Panther's real story. Not glorious combat, not technical vindication, just expensive, complicated failure. Here's what the Panther reveals about war, about technology, about human nature. We want to believe that excellence matters, that quality triumphs, that doing something right is better than doing something adequately. And in peacetime, in normal circumstances, that's often true. But war isn't normal circumstances. War is chaos. War is exhaustion. War is making the least bad decision with incomplete information under impossible stress. And in that environment, good enough beats perfect every single time, because good enough can be produced in numbers. Good enough can be maintained by tired mechanics with limited parts. Good enough can fail and be replaced. Perfect just fails. The Germans built the Panther believing it would prove their superiority. Instead, it proved that superiority is a myth, that every nation, every military, every system operates under constraints. And the winners aren't the ones with the best equipment. They're the ones who understand their constraints and work within them, who build weapons that match their industrial capacity, who accept good enough because good enough, multiplied by overwhelming numbers, beats perfection every time. Think about what Bachmann must have felt in his final days commanding Panthers. The slow, creeping realization that everything he'd been taught was wrong, that the weapons he'd trusted would betray him, that German engineering superiority was propaganda, not physics. How do you maintain fighting spirit when your tank is your enemy? How do you lead men into combat in machines that might kill you through failure before the enemy gets a chance? This is the psychological cost of ideological weapons design. You don't just lose tactically, you lose faith. When a Sherman broke down, American crews were frustrated. When a Panther broke down, German crews confronted the collapse of everything they'd been taught to believe. The tank wasn't just failing. The entire worldview that produced it was failing. And every mechanical breakdown was evidence that maybe, just maybe, democracy could out-engineer dictatorship, that American factories staffed by free workers could outproduce German factories staffed by slaves, that Soviet crude pragmatism could outlast German theoretical excellence. These were thoughts German crews had learned never to voice, but in the privacy of a disabled tank, waiting for recovery or death, those thoughts became impossible to avoid. The Panther program cost Germany approximately 1 billion Reichsmarks. For comparison, that was enough to produce every U-boat built during the entire war. or to fund half of Germany's jet fighter program, or to build thousands of anti-tank guns, which were actually effective and reliable. Instead, that money bought 6,000 Panthers, of which maybe 2,000 were combat effective at any given time, most of which broke down before they could meaningfully impact the war's outcome. This is what ideological weapons development looks like. Not rational cost-benefit analysis, not pragmatic assessment of needs versus resources, just the stubborn insistence that German weapons must be the best, regardless of whether best serves any strategic purpose. The tragedy is that German engineers were brilliant. They could have designed adequate tanks, reliable tanks, tanks that matched Germany's actual industrial capacity and logistical capabilities. But they were never asked to do that. They were asked to design the perfect tank. And they succeeded. The Panther was perfect. In the same way a Formula One race car is perfect, brilliant on a clean track with expert mechanics and unlimited resources, worthless everywhere else. In the end, the Panther didn't fail its army. The ideology that produced it failed the army. The belief system that insisted German weapons must be superior, that quality always beats quantity, that technical excellence can overcome material disadvantage. Those beliefs, not the engineering, killed the Panther. Because those beliefs created an environment where honest assessment was impossible, where field commanders couldn't say the tank doesn't work without being labeled defeatist, where engineers couldn't say we need a simpler design without being accused of insufficient faith in German capability, where the gap between propaganda and reality grew so wide that maintaining the fiction required willful blindness. The Panther was a magnificent tank in all the wrong ways. It was proof that you can engineer something perfect and still fail completely, that technical sophistication without operational reality is just expensive art. That war, brutal and unforgiving war, doesn't care about your design philosophy or your national mythology or your carefully calculated performance specifications. War cares about what works when nothing else does. The final Panthers were found abandoned across Germany in the last weeks of the war, out of fuel, out of parts, broken down. Some had been blown up by their own crews. Others just sat there, monuments to wasted potential. Soviet and American intelligence teams studied them carefully, measured the armor, tested the gun, examined the transmission, and they reached the same conclusion: impressive, flawed, not worth copying. The future of tank design would take elements from the Panther, but it would reject the philosophy that created it. The Panther taught the world what not to do, how not to design weapons, how not to run an industrial war, how not to let ideology override engineering common sense. It's a lesson written in broken final drives and abandoned hulls across Europe. A lesson some nations have learned, a lesson others keep forgetting. That supremacy is a story we tell ourselves. Reality is what's left when the transmission fails and the enemy is closing in and all your technical superiority can't save you. The Panther was the perfect tank, and that's exactly why it failed.